Imagine being the leader of the world's fourth largest economy, preparing for a 9:00 a.m. budget hearing. You're a self-proclaimed workaholic, someone who has publicly dismissed the very idea of work-life balance. And then, in the dead of night, you run into a problem. What is it? According to Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, it was a broken fax machine.
A fax machine! You can't make this stuff up.
Yes, a fax machine. And that was the official justification for hauling her senior staff to the official residence for a study session that began just after 3:40 a.m. This single meeting has ignited a firestorm.
It really has.
Her supporters see a tireless leader, but her critics, in a country still haunted by the word Karoshi, or death from overwork, see something far more dangerous. They see a leader who isn't just working herself to the bone, but who might be setting a fatal example for everyone else. Okay, let's unpack this. This isn't just a quirky news story about a late meeting involving, outdated technology.
Not at all.
This single event, the 3 a.m. study session, serves as a lightning rod, exposing the decades-long cultural war in Japan between tradition, dedication, economic need, and the lethal reality of overwork.
Right.
Our mission in this deep dive is to understand how this incident and the PM's subsequent policy proposals reflect and potentially deepen Japan's struggle with work-life balance.
And what you have here is just a perfect convergence of political theater, technological inertia, and this deep-seated cultural pathology.
That's a great way to put it.
The moment PM Takaichi stood up and defended that 3 a.m. session, she wasn't just addressing a procedural question. She was, drawing a line in the sand about what constitutes dedication in modern Japan.
So we have to see this as more than just a gaffe.
Oh, absolutely. It is crucial to frame this incident not as an isolated gaffe, but as a direct reflection of a foundational struggle over Japanese identity and productivity in the 21st century. Her personal work habits directly inform her policy decisions, creating a national crisis point around the issue of Karoshi.
So let's start with the leader herself and her chosen brand. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi came into office with a very specific, aggressive public image: the workhorse.
Yes. She's known as an inveterate workhorse, someone who often skips social gatherings and has openly rejected the very idea of work-life balance.
She hasn't just embodied it, she's made it a core part of her message.
It's the cornerstone of her political platform. Think about the rhetoric. She publicly pledged, "I myself will cast aside the idea of work-life balance. I'll work, 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 and work."
Wow.
I mean, this is a calculated statement. It's aimed at mobilizing a very specific segment of the Japanese electorate. And she went further, asking her party members, the LDP, the long-ruling Conservative Party, to work like a horse pulling a wagon.
That phrase, work like a horse, that must have landed badly with a lot of people. It sounds so visceral.
It caused an immediate visceral reaction, especially upsetting families of Karoshi victims who have fought for decades to regulate exactly this kind of brutal schedule.
But if it upset them, why do her supporters seem to embrace it so strongly?
Well, it speaks powerfully to the segment of the electorate that feels Japan has lost its way, that the nation's economic might was built on exactly this kind of sacrifice and discipline.
I see. So it's a nostalgic appeal.
Precisely. For her supporters, she's positioning herself as the tireless leader, focused solely on rebuilding the nation and restoring LDP dominance. It's an ideological stance that suggests, that the human cost is simply the price of national success. She becomes the embodiment of that traditional high-sacrifice Japanese work ethic.
And that relentless work ethic manifested spectacularly in this 3 a.m. study session. Can you walk us through the mechanics of that night? What actually happened?
Okay, so the meeting occurred shortly after 3 a.m. It involved several key aides, bureaucrats, senior staff, and it lasted for about 3 hours.
3 hours.
In the middle of the night.
In the middle of the night. And crucially, this was ahead of a 9 a.m. parliamentary budget session where the PM would be grilled by the opposition.
The logistics of that alone are just appalling. You're forcing staff to mobilize and operate at maximum mental capacity.
During the absolute deepest part of the night. It completely disrupts their circadian rhythms, and then they're expected to function effectively just 6 hours later in a super high-stakes environment.
So the controversy wasn't just about the hours themselves, it was about the public nature of it. Forcing staff to work in the wee hours in a country so scarred by Karoshi.
For many, this wasn't dedication. It was just putting unnecessary physical and mental burdens on your staff. It looked like the normalization of, management incompetence disguised as diligence.
Right. And former officials and critics were quick to condemn it.
Oh, immediately. As you mentioned, the opposition leader and former PM Yoshihiko Noda called the decision crazy. He stressed the obvious point. Everyone is asleep at that time. It's a sad attitude for a national leader.
Because it implies that only the leader's schedule matters.
And that efficiency is secondary to just being present.
Okay, now we have to delve into the excuse, which is, it's perhaps the most defining and frankly absurd detail of this entire story.
The fax machine.
The fax machine. What was the official justification for this national crisis meeting?
The Prime Minister, defending the action in Parliament, claimed that her home fax machine had malfunctioned.
Her home fax machine.
Yes, she stated this required her to urgently go to the official residence to retrieve and review critical documents and rewrite responses for lawmakers ahead of the hearing. She acknowledged the inconvenience, but insisted it was a matter of national security and legislative preparation.
A broken fax machine. In 2025, a world leader justifies a 3-hour, 3 a.m. mandatory staff session by pointing to a jammed thermal printer. This is where the story shifts from political drama to a harsh indictment of Japanese institutional efficiency.
It's more than ironic. It's symbolic of a systemic paralysis when it comes to digitalization. Critics immediately seized on this. They called her incompetent with tech and pointed out all the obvious alternatives.
Like what? PDF emails, encrypted documents,
scanners, anything. Any modern communication method that doesn't require dragging your staff out of bed at 3 in the morning. The defense itself unintentionally highlighted how utterly reliant parts of the Japanese government remain on this archaic, easily failable technology.
But the justifications didn't stop there, did they? Her ruling party, the LDP, immediately launched a counteroffensive.
Absolutely. This is where the political strategy kicks in. LDP supporters argued that the opposition MPs were the true culprits.
How so?
The defense was that the opposition frequently submits their questions for parliamentary sessions too late, sometimes right before the session, instead of sticking to the required 2-day prior deadline.
I see. So they're claiming this forces officials, including the PM staff, to work round the clock to prepare legally sound answers.
Exactly.
So if the opposition adheres to this practice, it forces the bureaucracy to work all night.
But Takaichi's decision to call a meeting at 3 a.m. was still a management choice, wasn't it?
It sounds like a perfect circular system of institutional dysfunction, where everyone blames everyone else for violating a rule that no one seems capable of enforcing.
It certainly looks dysfunctional, but you have to acknowledge that for the LDP, this blame shifting is politically strategic.
It's a distraction.
A necessary distraction from the PM's management choices. It frames the late-night work not as a self-imposed burden, but as patriotic duty forced upon them by irresponsible political opponents. But critics weren't buying the necessary hard work narrative.
Right. They framed the 3 a.m. session as a clear, avoidable management failure.
Precisely. They argued this wasn't about dedication. It was poor planning and time management disguised as diligence. Many saw it as a pure power move that only benefits the boss's ego, a performative act. We heard critics call it populism, suggesting it was literally a living LinkedIn post.
A living LinkedIn post. That's a fantastic, scathing distillation of the problem.
It is.
It suggests the work was not inherently necessary, but performative, designed to signal sacrifice and dedication rather than achieve genuine, effective productivity.
Right. Because when you force people to work at 3 a.m., you are prioritizing volume and presence over well-rested, high-quality decision-making.
And that's the core inefficiency baked into the system.
Exactly. As one source noted, nothing truly productive is generated at 3 a.m. that couldn't have been achieved through better scheduling or prioritizing earlier in the day. This feeds into a wider critique of Japanese corporate culture, where historically, analysts spend hours triple and quadruple checking inconsequential reports, seeking to move quality from 99% to 100% for something that ultimately doesn't require that level of scrutiny. The emphasis is on time spent, leading to astronomical and often stupid amounts of mandatory time spent at the desk.
So the 3 a.m. meeting, regardless of the fax machine excuse, it just screams that volume is prioritized over effectiveness.
100%.
We can only understand the visceral reaction to Takaichi's 3 a.m. session if we place it within the deep historical shadow hanging over Japan, the constant specter of Karoshi. Let's establish the full weight of this concept.
Karoshi literally translates to death from overwork. It remains a profoundly serious, deeply embedded social issue in Japan. The term itself isn't ancient. It was coined back in 1978.
And its creation was a critical turning point.
It was, because the anti-Karoshi movement that followed gained crucial momentum. It provided a formal framework and a medical basis to prove that long, excessive hours induce stress, often leading to heart attacks, strokes, or even suicide, all resulting in premature death.
So it gave legal recognition for victims and their families.
Exactly. It became legally and medically defensible that an employee's job could literally kill them.
And the most high-profile case in recent memory, the one that finally put teeth into the regulations, was the scandal involving the advertising giant Dentsu.
The Dentsu tragedy of 2015-2016 is a monumental case in Japanese labor history. It's centered on a young advertising employee named Sanae Takaichi. She tragically died by suicide after logging over 100 hours of overtime monthly in the months leading up to her death.
100 hours of overtime. That's a staggering number. It puts her immediately into the highest risk category for Karoshi. What do we know about her situation?
We know from her reported messages and logs that the stress was unrelenting. She reported sleeping only 10 hours per week just before taking her own life.
10 hours a week.
Per week. Former colleagues testified that management had coerced her into this unsustainable schedule, often through intense workplace pressure and monitoring. The public outrage wasn't just about the death of a promising young woman. It was the realization that this practice was systemic and predatory.
And the resulting legal action, it kind of demonstrated both the severity of the problem and, well, the initial leniency of the courts toward this kind of corporate abuse.
Yeah, precisely. While the company president eventually admitted guilt, the initial penalty was shockingly light, a fine of only 500,000 yen.
Which is barely $3,000 US.
It's nothing, a slap on the wrist for a corporate behemoth like Dentsu. And this sparked further public fury because it suggested that the price for killing an employee through overwork was, negligible.
But the resulting reform, enacted in 2019, fundamentally changed the legal landscape by imposing actual limits on overtime and introducing criminal penalties for violations, something we'll get into more later. But this whole debate over extreme work culture is far older than Dentsu or Takaichi.
Oh, much older. We have to trace this debate back to the 1970s and 80s. That's when the initial focus was on establishing the weekend system known as Shuki Futsukase.
So standardized 5-day work week. That was considered radical back then.
Surprisingly, yes, in the high-growth post-war economy. By 1973, many large Japanese companies were actually experimenting with some form of the system, holding out the promise of moving away from the work, high-growth mentality toward a more balanced social welfare economy.
So what stopped that momentum?
History intervened dramatically with the 1973 oil shock. As oil and commodity prices spiked globally, profit outlooks for Japanese industry quickly weakened. And this economic upheaval just shattered the hopes of leisure and permanently shifted corporate psychology.
So companies aggressively backtracked on those promises.
Immediately. Corporate reluctance was fueled by immediate profit concerns. They cited fears that standardizing the weekend would only increase the need for overtime during the week or, critically, reduce productivity overall.
The fear was that resting would equal failing.
That is the enduring psychological effect of that era. Business and political leaders stubbornly insisted that productivity required maintaining the same sheer volume of work hours. They simply did not entertain the possibility. A possibility modern research confirms, that better rested employees might achieve the same, or better, results in less time.
The debate just shifted away from quality of life and toward a relentless prioritization of volume. And this commitment to volume, regardless of efficiency, led directly to one of the most insidious problems that persists today. Unpaid overtime, universally known as service overtime.
This is a critical point that undermines any claim of a voluntary workforce ethic. The partial adoption of a weekend system often did absolutely nothing to curb the prevalence of this mandatory unpaid work.
And we have data on this.
We do. We have data confirming that by 1985, white-collar employees at large firms were receiving no pay for roughly 30 hours of overtime per month. Managers would just pressure employees not to accurately report their hours, making sure the books looked clean while the workers burned out.
It effectively became an institutionalized health risk, didn't it? One of the sources noted that this overwork culture forced Japanese workers to put their bodily integrity on the line for their jobs.
And it wasn't just abstract stress. Historically, this often meant mandatory night-after-night binge drinking and chain smoking at drink outings, the nomikai, immediately after the long workday.
Right.
Salarymen would become malnourished, alcoholic, and chronically sleep-deprived, classic symptoms of overwork that led directly to cardiovascular incidents recognized as Karoshi.
So the stimulus just changed over time.
In many ways, yes. Japanese workplaces never broke this brutal habit. The stimulants changed from, say, amphetamines used during World War II to B vitamin shots and caffeine pills today, but the expectation of brutal, sustained schedules remains.
So the core activist argument that the problem is the sheer volume of work, not its distribution, has been consistently ignored by political and business leaders.
And that resistance is precisely why external observers remain skeptical, even after the 2019 Dentsu reforms. We can't be certain that companies fully compensated employees for all outstanding wages owed for unpaid overtime, especially with managerial pressure to underreport.
And without firm regulations.
And high base wages and stiff penalties, all things labor activists have long demanded. The incentive for companies to put workers at risk in search of profit remains incredibly powerful. Which brings us right back to PM Takaichi, who, shortly after her 3 a.m. meeting, launched a policy proposal that seems to deliberately undermine the progress made on these regulations.
That's a smooth transition, because the controversy over her personal work ethic immediately morphed into a major policy debate. Shortly after the 3 a.m. incident, PM Takaichi ordered a review of deregulation of working hours, making it one of her first priorities.
Yes, this was officially titled the Corporate Reform No. 1 Task. The explicit aim was to revisit and potentially lift upper limits on overtime, despite the Dentsu tragedy establishing those caps just a few years earlier.
She did try to frame it carefully, though.
She did. She added that the directive included promoting rule maintenance to support various ways of working on the premise of maintaining mental and physical health and choosing employees.
That caveat about maintaining health and offering choice seems like mandatory political cover, given the weight of the Karoshi history. The underlying objective is clearly to increase the legal capacity for work volume.
It puts the entire 2019 cap system on the table for redesign, and that creates an immediate battleground between those concerned about destroying the purpose of work-style reform and those who champion expanding workers' options to address structural economic needs.
Okay, so to understand the stakes, we need to review the current legal status quo that was established after the Dentsu case. What are the key numbers?
The current law, in effect since 2019, is meant to be a hard, legally binding guardrail against Karoshi. The standard in-principle limit for overtime is 45 hours per month and 360 hours per year.
That's the first tier.
Right, designed to be the maximum sustainable load. However, the law allows for a second tier under special circumstances defined by a labor management agreement. But even with that agreement, the law established absolute non-negotiable hard ceilings.
Which are?
Overtime cannot exceed 100 hours per month, 720 hours per year, or an average of 80 hours per 2 to 6 months.
That 100-hour monthly limit is critically important, isn't it?
It is the Karoshi line. Medically, exceeding 80 hours of overtime per month is defined as the threshold where the risk of death from overwork significantly increases. The 100-hour limit is the final legal barrier.
And crucially, there are real penalties.
Yes, violating these caps subjects companies to sanctions, including criminal punishment. This is a law with teeth. And Takaichi is now ordering the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare to begin discussions on redesigning this very system.
So let's analyze the arguments supporting this move, led by Takaichi herself. She's framing this in part as an economic necessity for the worker.
She is. She supports allowing more overtime, viewing that pay as an absolutely essential source of income for many workers and their families. This is a very powerful, practical argument.
She's worried that if the caps reduce overtime pay, workers will be forced to take on side jobs.
Exactly. Unfamiliar side jobs like driving for a rideshare app or delivering goods to make ends meet. Her fear is that taking on an unfamiliar side gig, often without health oversight, might potentially damage their health in a different, arguably more dangerous way than controlled overtime at their primary job.
That financial pressure is the painful calculation of risk and reward you mentioned earlier. A middle-aged factory worker might see more income as a lifeline to cover their kids' university tuition.
And it pits family provision directly against personal health. It's a classic dilemma of a low-wage economy. Furthermore, the push for relaxation is also driven by structural demands within the Japanese economy.
The manpower shortage.
A serious, escalating manpower shortage driven by demographics. The Japanese management community, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, are demanding flexible management.
And the distinction between SMEs and big corporates is vital here.
It is. The sources tell us that the main pressure for relaxation is not coming from the large corporate lobbies. Big corporates, scarred by the Dentsu case and facing immense legal risk, are generally strict about compliance.
So the pressure is coming from below.
Overwhelmingly from SMEs, which collectively make up close to 90% of employment in Japan, but lack direct, high-level political representation. They are the ones struggling most acutely with labor shortages and demanding differential application of the cap by industry.
So while the argument is framed by Takaichi as expanding workers' options and respecting employee choice, the pressure points are financial coercion for the worker and structural manpower deficits for the SME employer.
Which brings us to the arguments against relaxation from the labor side. They see this move as a step backward into the abyss. Tomoko Yoshino, who heads Rengo Japan's largest umbrella group for labor unions, issued a severe warning. She stated that easing restrictions would directly counteract recent work style reforms and approach the precise threshold that heightens the risk of karoshi.
The critics are clear. They fear this policy will be abusive and not truly about voluntary choice, but financial coercion. They argue that if base salaries were adequate, workers wouldn't need to put their bodily integrity on the line for overtime pay.
And this reveals a deeper cynicism about the policy's motivations within the political sphere. Some critics dismiss the move as pure ideology or political pandering to the LDP's core voter base.
Which is?
The older generation, sometimes derisively called the Showa Ojisan bubble generation, who fundamentally believe young people are lazy and entitled. For this influential voter base, loosening the cap is seen as restoring the spirit that made Japan great.
But the reality is that by targeting the overtime cap, Takaichi is primarily giving relief to the segment of the economy, SMEs, that is already struggling the most with labor supply and often has the worst managerial oversight.
Exactly. It's a complex, multifactorial issue, but the prevailing ideology is dangerous because it ignores the foundational problem. Critics argue vehemently that instead of loosening the cap, what Japan really needs is an expansion of the Labor Standards Inspection Office's authority and budget.
And stricter enforcement to prevent unpaid service overtime.
Right. Loosening the cap is perceived by many labor experts as the dumbest possible way to try and solve a national productivity and demographic crisis. It's treating the symptom-low worker income and business manpower shortages by exacerbating the disease overwork and karoshi risk.
This debate around Takaichi's 3 a.m. session and her subsequent policy proposal cuts right across the cultural core of Japan, specifically how performance and dedication are measured. We are witnessing a monumental clash of generations and values.
We absolutely are. We see two profoundly different views of dedication and conflict. For the older generation, the political and business leaders quoted in the news working 24/7 is a necessary commitment, particularly for national leaders.
They compare it to being a police officer or a doctor.
Exactly. Professions that are expected to work around the clock when needed. For them, dedication is fundamentally measured in hours, in visible sacrifice, and in physical presence. They genuinely do not understand why the public is making a fuss about Takaichi working hard for the Japanese people.
But the younger generation, alongside many critics, is questioning the very premise of this measurement. They're asking, should dedication be measured by the clock or by effectiveness and working smart?
And does a leader who is tired and sleep-deprived genuinely make better decisions at 3 a.m. than one who is well-rested at 9 a.m.? This is the critical philosophical rift separating contemporary Japanese society.
You have the Showa Ojisan bubble generation,
who clings to the belief that brute force, high volume, and long hours are the spirit that forged Japan's post-war success. They view calls for work-life balance as a sign of weakness or entitlement.
versus a younger generation that sees things very differently.
The younger generation sees the need for work-life balance not as leisure, but as a pragmatic necessity for sustainable productivity and creativity. They view the excessive hours as nothing more than performative bullshit that ultimately kills people.
To bring this abstract conflict to life, there was an excellent analogy in the source material that helps illustrate this cultural split. The conversation between the company owner, Mr. Sato, and the young engineer, Yui.
Right. Mr. Sato represents that nostalgic older generation. He admires Takaichi's energy, seeing her dedication as embodying the spirit that built the nation. For him, there is no real separation between work and life. Dedication is measured in presence, endurance, and visible sacrifice.
But Yui, the younger engineer, questions the utility of it all.
Her questions are sharp and pragmatic. She asks, is this effective governance? What if a tired leader makes a poor decision that affects millions? And what message does it send to my generation that we must sacrifice our entire lives and health for our jobs to be considered dedicated?
Her perspective reframes dedication entirely.
For her, dedication should be measured by the quality of output, efficiency, and the capacity to return to work refreshed, mentally engaged, and creative. She demands structural integrity, not just personal sacrifice.
Which is why the political reaction to Takaichi's 3 a.m. decision was so strong. Opposition leader Noda called it crazy, stressing that the highest level of government shouldn't endorse a dysfunctional system.
A system where the only way to advance is brute force. It suggests a profound structural failure, where the only path to success, whether political or corporate, is through unsustainable self-harm.
And what's fascinating is how Takaichi's high-octane work ethic conflicts with broader, measurable emerging trends in the Japanese workplace.
It's a huge disconnect. While she champions the work model, Japan's historic, relentless work ethic is actually declining significantly.
We are seeing a complete breakdown of the traditional social contract of lifelong, high-sacrifice employment. Tell us about the statistics around this disengagement.
Well, we're seeing a staggering trend in disengagement. A significant portion of the workforce, up to 45% of workers in some sectors, now openly admit they are quiet quitting.
Just doing the bare minimum.
The bare minimum necessary to keep their jobs, refusing to engage in unpaid service overtime or any form of unnecessary performative labor.
And this isn't just passive disengagement. There are more active, even aggressive forms of pushback.
Absolutely. We are also seeing the rise of revenge quitters. Employees who leave their jobs in a deliberate mess, often after compiling evidence of managerial abuse or forced unpaid labor. This is a dramatic escalation.
It suggests a deep-seated frustration.
And a lack of institutional respect for the traditional employment structure. They feel betrayed by the decades-old promise that total dedication would be rewarded.
So Takaichi is pushing a system of forced dedication and volume at the very moment the workforce, especially the younger cohort, is actively disengaging and seeking balance, realizing the old bargain is lethal.
Her actions, therefore, are far more than just political theater. They are a public endorsement of an unsustainable, dangerous work model that younger generations and many labor experts are desperately trying to dismantle. It's a profound disconnect between the political aspiration, the dream of a revitalized, high-growth, high-sacrifice Japan, and the physical and psychological reality of the modern Japanese worker.
As we synthesize this deep dive, the core tension remains crystal clear. The 3 a.m. meeting, whether the catalyst was a jammed fax machine or late questions from the opposition, and the subsequent policy move to relax overtime caps are not isolated incidents.
Not at all.
They are the nexus point where the financial necessity of the Japanese worker, the individual who needs overtime pay to make ends meet, clashes directly with the public health crisis of Karoshi.
And what is truly fascinating here is that the entire debate over work-life balance is fundamentally a value judgment made by the political and corporate elites. When you trace the history of the weekend system debate back to the 1970s and look at Takaichi's current policy, the underlying unspoken principle remains that profit maintenance remains the most essential goal.
Over the quality of life and health of employees.
Right.
And we saw how political and corporate leaders historically dismissed the idea that working less could lead to better, more efficient work. That resistance persists now in the form of Takaichi's core belief that reducing overtime pay will automatically lead to people seeking out dangerous side jobs.
Rather than promoting the idea that the system should ensure a high enough base wage so they don't need excessive overtime at all.
Exactly.
Without firm regulations, high base wages, and stiff criminal penalties for non-compliance and service overtime, the incentive for companies to put workers at physical risk in search of maximum profit persists and regenerates.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
It is. Employees feel financial pressure. Managers demand unpaid or excessive hours to meet goals. And political leaders like Takaichi defend the necessity of this high-volume dedication as a requirement for national greatness.
So the legacy of Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi will ultimately be defined by whether her high-octane work ethic and policy pushes lead to a revitalized, highly productive Japan, or if they merely perpetuate a cycle of exhaustion, inefficiency, and further entrench the shadow of death from overwork.